If you study or read history long enough, especially at an academic level, you'll soon come across reference to sources, in particular what are referred to as primary, secondary, and tertiary historical sources. The use of any kind of sources in order to record history by historians attempting to gather information from people or texts close to the time of specific events, rather than merely relying on rumour, hearsay, legend, or myth, dates back at least to the Greek historian Herodotus, around 2,400 years before present, though there are very likely earlier historians who did the same or something similar whose work is now lost to us. However, it is the Greek historian Thucydides, writing shortly after Herodotus, who is credited with the first known recorded attempt to practice historiography, not merely recording history, but analysing it systematically, not simply using sources, but assessing sources for reliability and differentiating between strong and weak sources. Scholars debate the extent to which Thucydides was successful in this endeavour, but generally agree this is what he was trying to do. Today, the kind of source analysis Thucydides attempted has become much more developed and sophisticated, and thus, in modern historiography, it is typical to differentiate between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. This video explains what these sources are, how they are used, and where to find them. Modern origin of source analysis. The formal, systematized academic use of sources in professional historiography today, as opposed to the far more loose, inconsistent, and unprofessional method of Thucydides, is often attributed to the 19th century German historian Leopold Ranke, often represented as the originator of history as a modern academic discipline. Ranke's philosophy of history was predicated on the idea that history as a discipline was the process of identifying facts in the past by locating and analysing sources of information in immediate proximity to the events they describe, what are now called primary sources. Ranke believed that this process, known as source criticism, was necessary for the accurate reconstruction of the past. He believed facts about the past often left a physical presence in the form of some kind of record, and thus regarded historical facts as accessible to the present because they are embedded in primary sources from the past. To use a metaphor, Ranke believed historical sources could be mined for the nuggets of historical facts they contained. It should be noted that alternative views of historical facts and the way sources relate to them have also been developed, but I'll save that for another video. Despite his reputation, Ranke was not the originator of this source-critical method of history, which had already been well established a century previously by German scholars working in textual analysis, particularly the assessment of theological texts, such as the Greek and Latin manuscripts on which various translations of the Bible were based, and the literary and religious texts of ancient Greece and Rome. However, Ranke certainly developed, popularized, and promoted this method of source criticism in the field of historiography, and is consequently regarded as one of its most important and influential proponents. What are primary, secondary, and tertiary sources? On screen now, I've placed an image from the Mercer University Libraries which explains the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. It's a useful summary of these different source types, but if you want more detail, see the link to my list of references in the video description, which contains a list of academic websites defining these source types in depth. Primary sources are sources of information made at the same time as the historical people and events they describe. Think of them as first-hand accounts. These include physical artifacts as diverse as architecture and weapons, textual records such as letters, inscriptions, speeches, newspaper articles by journalists with first-hand knowledge, fictional writings and other literature, legal documents and financial records, and media such as maps, artworks, photographs, pictures, paintings, and other audio or visual records. Primary sources are potential sources of information, but they always need to be analysed in their socio-historical context, which is the time and place in which they originated, and they need to be interpreted, typically by specialists in relevant fields, such as literary analysts, linguists, historians, archaeologists, and lexicographers. Secondary sources interpret primary sources. They are separated from the events described in the primary sources by time or place or both. Think of them as second-hand accounts. They analyze and comment on primary sources, aiming to establish their validity, meaning, and significance in their context. An article on the American Journal Experts website helps explain the difference between primary and secondary sources on the basis of 5 criteria. Quote, 1. Was the source created by someone directly involved in the events? If yes, it is primary. If not, it is secondary. 2. Does the source provide original information? If yes, it is primary. 3. Does it summarize information from other sources? If yes, it is secondary. 4. Are you directly analyzing the source itself? If yes, it is primary. 5. Is someone else describing the source? If yes, it is secondary. End quote. Tertiary sources synthesize and summarize primary and secondary sources, aiming to provide convenient access to the essential information in these sources with minimal effort on the part of the reader. Tertiary sources include dictionaries, encyclopedias, textbooks, manuals, directories, fact books, and annotated bibliographies. Many tertiary sources, such as Encyclopaedia Britannica, the Oxford English Dictionary, and high school textbooks, are written for a more general audience, members of the public who aren't specialists or academics. However, some tertiary sources are high-end academic resources specifically for specialists in the field, such as scholarly handbooks, lexicons, and expert knowledge dictionaries and encyclopedias, such as the professional handbooks published by Oxford and Cambridge universities, or professional language resources, such as the University of Chicago's Assyrian Dictionary. Although these can be used by non-specialists, and I've consulted plenty of them myself, they are often challenging to read and understand without an academic background in the field, since they typically assume the reader already has a considerable body of knowledge on the subject, including a familiarity with the current scholarly consensus, key primary sources, and areas of scholarly discussion, debate, or controversy. More than once, I've had to stop reading a chapter in a work like this after it just became too difficult for me to follow and understand because I simply didn't have the necessary background knowledge. When this happens, you need to switch to a more accessible tertiary or secondary source. Terminology confusion. Primary sources versus primary literature. At this point, I need to address a potential confusion arising from terminology, understanding the difference between the terms primary sources and primary literature. On screen now, I've placed an image from the Ohio Northern University Library, which uses the terms primary literature, secondary literature, and tertiary literature. Under the terms secondary literature and tertiary literature, the image lists sources we've seen previously defined as secondary and tertiary sources. So, okay, in these cases, the word literature is just another way of saying sources. However, under the term primary literature, this image lists sources which are different from those we've previously seen defined as primary sources. This image defines primary literature as, quote, original research and or new scientific discoveries, immediate results of research activities, often includes analysis of data collected in the field or laboratory, end quote. Then it lists these examples, quote, original research published as articles in peer-reviewed journals, dissertations, technical reports, conference proceedings, end quote. So take care when you see references to primary literature. It doesn't mean the same thing as primary sources. It's a reference to original research of some kind. This is why I prefer to use the conventional source terminology, since it avoids this confusion. Which sources should I start reading? This really depends on your familiarity with the subject you're researching. If you're unfamiliar with the subject, start with the tertiary sources. They should tell you the current scholarly consensus, which is what the majority of qualified professionals in the field agree on, provide an overview of the subject, and cite the most important primary and secondary sources, sometimes providing a short bibliography or reference list which will be very useful for your own research of the secondary sources. If you're reasonably familiar with the subject, start with the secondary sources. The best and most up-to-date of these will usually be found in scholarly journal articles, since they are researched and published much faster than book-length treatments. Depending on the field, journal articles very often start with a literature review, which is an assessment of the current scholarship of the field, typically organized chronologically, explaining how key research questions, findings, and contributions have emerged, and how they have been received by other scholars in the field. A literature review is very useful. It's like an annotated bibliography or list of references describing important works you can use to investigate the topic further. It's a great start for your research. Another good way to find secondary sources is to read the academic bibliographies you can find on university department websites. These reference lists have been prepared by specialists in the field, typically by professors or other academics, who have collected and curated them specifically for use by their students, so they're a reliable way of discovering good quality secondary sources. If you're investigating a subject on which you have plenty of knowledge, you could start directly with the primary sources. You probably already have a good idea of which secondary and tertiary sources to use to check your understanding and analysis. Where can I find free primary, secondary, and tertiary sources? If you're wondering where to find good primary, secondary, and tertiary sources without having to pay any money, look in the video description, where I've not only placed a link to all my references for this video, but also placed a link to a page on my website where I provide links to a wide range of freely accessible online material consisting of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources suitable for research on a wide variety of topics. In later videos, I'll be describing the overall research cycle and the typical academic research method by which you locate, validate, and synthesize your sources. I'll also explain the research source hierarchy by which you can differentiate between stronger and weaker sources, as well as understanding how different types of sources relate to different forms of research.